Very happy to be here, and I'd like to reiterate that we are very happy with the funding and the support for that research. So TIGER stands also for tinnitus, genes, and environmental risks. We at the Karolinska, we've been coordinating this project together with 4 other institutions with different specialties. The Institute Mario Negri, who has expertise in epidemiology, Granada University with specialty in genetics, and then the University of Bergen in Norway with statistics expertise. And after some time, we also have had additional collaborators within contributions from England and Germany as well. So tinnitus is a phantom perception. It's something that is very linked to chronic pain and the mechanisms in the brain. So it's the perception of a sound that does not exist. It's quite often associated with hearing loss, and it's very highly impacting for people that suffer from it. We estimated that it's about 3,500 euros in costs for society per year. And many of the aspects around sex and gender and how this influences tinnitus severity are unknown. And this is what we try to address. At the beginning of our work, here are some radar plots that show on a normalized scale the burden that's associated with tinnitus. We have different questionnaires in different regions with different colors. In blue, we have domains around tinnitus, loudness, awareness, annoyance. On the right side, fear of tinnitus, catastrophizing scales, which are domains that are used in pain as well, hyperacusis, stress, anxiety, depression in the bottom, and then quality of life. And what you can see here on the left are the surface area, which means how much burden it is for men, and then afterwards for women. And when we overlay the two, we see in pink that the area for women is larger than that for men, meaning they suffer more for those that have experienced constant tinnitus. Constant tinnitus means the very persisting, permanent ringing all the time. And because of that, I'd say among the results, we've been very happy, and that would like to share that we had about 28 open access publications that were released. Very proud we had some of the papers published in Lancet, JAMA Neurology as well. Very happy about that. We had a huge dissemination. You see the Altmetrics force for those that are familiar with this. Nice outreach also. The different groups were awarded international prizes. There was also promotions. We had 2 permanent positions for those that were working in the different groups. We had individuals that became advisors in 2 patient organizations. We had also 2 national recommendations from the work that we've generated. We've been given that to the national programs as well. And we had new papers, releases, mentions in the Washington Post and so on, so which is very nice. So part of the strategy that we had was to first try to identify a better subtype tinnitus and then segregate that into sex or gender. We collaborated with local cohorts in Sweden. For instance, on the left you have here the Swedish Twin Registry Life Gene, Swedish Longitudinal Occupational Survey of Health, and thanks to these we were able to perform some epidemiology and understand better risk factors. And then we, from some of these calls, we were able to recruit participants and give them some surveys, and then invite a subset of these that were located in the Stockholm region and perform in-depth audiometry. And then we had blood and DNA collected to start analyzing for biomarkers as well. And that's the idea, was to check for genetics, plasma biomarkers, and also electrophysiology, see what's going on in the brain. One of the first things that we wanted to assess is whether this increased burden that we've seen in women would also be translated into a risk of suicides, because this has been mentioned in individual cases. It has never been evidenced. And here we see that there is an increased risk for suicidal attempts, and this risk is greater in women that experience any type of tinnitus. This can be something that is intermittent, constant, pulsatile. There are individuals that perceive a tinnitus that is in this type of format. And when we go to severe tinnitus, this risk increases. And strangely enough, that risk doesn't happen in men. And this was a big surprise. One of the positive things that we've seen, I'd say for women, is that if they had seen a specialty care before the survey, that risk was abolished. That means even if we have no effective treatment today for tinnitus, the simple fact that they had been seeing someone from a specialty healthcare system was abolishing this risk. So because of that, we thought then if there is a burden associated with severe tinnitus, what about the genetics behind that? So the first thing, we looked at twins, and there we used one of the largest cohorts in Sweden, and we were able to show that some forms of tinnitus, those that are present on both ears, have a significant genetic influence, unlike unilateral tinnitus, which was not the case. And then, because we wondered whether this could be influenced by the family environment, we went into adoptees. So we took national data from the whole country and collected that also together with the medical registry data. We identified the individuals that were adopted, find out their parents, the adoptive parents, but also their biological parents. And we could show that if the adoptive parents had tinnitus, there was no greater risk for the child to have it, but only if the biological parent had it. Unfortunately, this was a sample size that was insufficient for us to assess the effects of sex or gender. So we went to collect our own data, and there we performed a familial aggregation. And there the question was, if you have tinnitus yourself and you have a sibling, what's the risk that this sibling also has it? And there we found, and strangely enough also, that if you have severe tinnitus, then there is a risk for the sibling 5 times the odds to have it. But if you stratify by sex, then you see that women have a 10 times greater risk. So it's double than in men. And this level is about what you see in schizophrenia. And this is strange because nowadays, when people go to the clinic and ask for care for tinnitus, it often is considered a symptom. Nobody asks about family relationships. When we looked at risk factors, we performed a systematic review, and we were very sad to see that it's only audiological factors that were demonstrated in the literature, but there is a paucity of those risk factors and studies of high quality. This is an example. This is only for auditory-related disorders. It's very few, and only 1 out of 5 of these studies have performed sex-aggregated analysis. When we performed our analysis ourselves, we've shown strong associations between temporomandibular joint disorders, which is tensions in the jaw, headache, but also hyperacusis, which is the sensitivity to noise, in which women experience it worse than men. And we think, in fact, that hyperacusis in women could be a preceding indication of tinnitus later on. This is ongoing work. So the next question was to understand more also the dynamics of tinnitus and how it transitions. So we used longitudinal data. It was collected every 2 years over a period of 10 years, in which it was self-reported people saying we had tinnitus sometimes, often, or already constant. And we showed that if you have it sometimes, there is a risk for getting it constant later on, but that risk becomes greater if you already have it often. And if you have it already constant, there is a 500 odds ratio to get it permanent later on. So there is a moment where the system breaks and tinnitus becomes permanent. This risk is 2 times greater in men than in women, and there is no influence of severity on that risk, strangely enough. So we want to collect electrophysiology, and what we've shown is that there is a big difference between people that have constant tinnitus or occasional. And once tinnitus becomes constant, the wave responses, which you see here, it's an electrophysiological response of the auditory nerve, and this shows that in the midbrain, the midbrain has changes in plasticity that could be translated into problems like tinnitus. This is seen in constant tinnitus individuals, but not in occasional tinnitus. At the moment tinnitus becomes constant, the nerves freeze, and then you have it all your life. And there is no gender influence in this aspect. Then we went into analyzing some of the genes. What is present here for severe tinnitus? There were some findings in the literature about some common variants, but we have failed in replicating these in large cohort analysis of about 700,000 people. So instead we went into narrowing the phenotype to very severe tinnitus and performing whole genome sequencing analysis, and we were able to replicate some rare variants in these genes that are here, which encode plasticity genes, and then these have a strong relationship with severe tinnitus. Together, this suggests that when tinnitus becomes constant or severe, then we have what is potentially a neurological disorder. This is a model that we have built based on the results, and what we believe is that during the young age, individuals experience tinnitus on occasions. They go to parties, they go to discotheques, and the more frequent this becomes, then the greater risk of getting it constant. And we show that this is greater in males. Once it's becoming constant, then genetics come and play a role. And here in women, it makes severity becoming greater. And this is also important because it reflects on the need for greater management for women at the clinical setting. So some of the expected socioeconomic impacts of our research, we hope that we've made evidence that severe tinnitus is a neurological disorder. It's not a symptom. It requires much more prevention now that we know that there is a risk for becoming constant if you already experience it at a young age, and it needs more resources at the level of the healthcare system. We hope that this is going to encourage more funding for tinnitus, because we've seen that at the European level, where this has been receiving recognition, at the national level in Europe, this is completely forgotten. And this is a struggle. I just came now from a meeting, and I've met with industry partners, and our findings is really encouraging them to launch research in that area now that we've found some of the first variants and genetic targets for disease. We've also contributed in motivating the patient organizations and increasing funding, and they really appreciate our work. And we're working together with other colleagues to re-innovate the European guidelines. We were involved 6 years earlier to try to include the importance of sex and gender in the management of tinnitus. In conclusion, what we show is that there is an increased risk in suicidal attempts in women, and that this burden can be alleviated if you have preceding specialty care. It also means that at the moment that women start seeing a general physicist for tinnitus, they need even better considerations. Often they're not taken seriously because they complain about it and they say it's just stress and emotions, you should try to find a way to live with it, but they do need care. The medical treatment, that was an interesting finding, because since there was little research on sex and gender in tinnitus, I organized a research topic in Frontiers to try to have people contributing with their own research. And what was the outcome of this topical issue is that women respond better to treatments than men. So there's something also here that needs further exploration. We've made also a global estimate of the prevalence of tinnitus, which is around 2%. There's no difference between the sexes. And finally, we've shown that severe tinnitus is associated with rare variants, altered midbrain function, and we believe that this should be a new definition that we would say is a disorder. Directions for the future. We've understood that when working with severe tinnitus, this is a very small portion of the population, and if you stratify again with sex or gender, and now there are more nuances into the definitions, the data that we have is insufficient. So we need not only we've discussed before, about including better definitions in the current codes, but likewise for tinnitus. Finally, would better genetic analysis be able to really demonstrate that it is a neurological disorder completely independent from other ones, like chronic pain or epilepsy, things like that? And finally, one question that we're wondering also is whether there was an influence of the sexual or the gender identity of the individuals that gave treatment to those patients and the outcome and the benefits that we've seen for women. And finally, there is a great need for better quality studies on the risk factors. There's nothing known and nothing that is serious enough to really establish those potential causal relationships with tinnitus, and it has to take sex and gender into account. We need also objective measures for tinnitus. Nowadays, it's only self-reported. We have no means of assessing this in a way that's quantifiable, that will also boost research and the involvement of the pharma industry into developing new treatments for them. And finally, I didn't mention this, but our whole analysis on the plasma failed. We found no biomarkers in the plasma. But instead, we believe that if we go down into cerebrospinal fluids, maybe there we can see indications of inflammation, which is something that has been demonstrated in animals too. Voila. And I would like to thank a lot the GenderNet Copeless Fund for allowing us to make this happen. It was a big change for tinnitus sufferers. Thank you.